Morning. How's everybody? That's good.
Morning, folks. Thanks for bearing with us. So we're here to announce the short-term tourism levy register. We have some brief speeches, and then if we can, questions only on the subject, and then we'll do any other business. There's a tight schedule this morning, as there's obligations here and some of the individuals. So if I can ask Minister Martin to open proceedings.
Dave Galair, I'm pleased to confirm that the Government has approved the drafting of the registration of short-term tourist letting bill and publication of the general scheme of the bill. Before I address some of the detail contained in the bill, I want to speak to the need for a short-term tourist letting register and how that will contribute to the objectives in Housing for All, which requires an all-of-government effort. The establishment of the short-term tourist letting register is another important step in implementing the Government's Housing for All policy. Housing for All includes the objective of making more efficient use of existing housing. One of the actions to achieve this objective is the development of a new regulatory controls requiring short-term and holiday lets to register with Fáilte Ireland, with a view to ensuring that houses are used to best effect in areas of housing need. For context, Fáilte Ireland estimates that there are approximately 30,000 short-term tourist letting properties in the state currently being advertised online. Some 60% to 70% of these are full houses and apartments. In the absence of a register, it is difficult to be precise as to how many properties may return to the long-term market. However, given the existing planning restrictions in place for short-term letting and the experience internationally, for example in Amsterdam, Fáilte Ireland estimates that perhaps as many as 12,000 of these properties could return to the traditional long-term market. As Minister for Tourism, I am of course very aware that the implementation of these proposals may impact upon the availability of accommodation for tourist purposes. However, the adverse effect of short-term letting for tourist purposes in areas of housing need conflicts with the need for sustainable tourism development, and it is appropriate to strengthen regulatory controls. The proposal approved by Government today includes an up to 6-month clarification period, which gives time for local authorities to begin processing queries and change of planning permissions for accommodation providers. Additionally, as many accommodation providers will already have businesses on the books for 2023, to minimise disruption to the tourism industry and to tourists, property owners operating within the sector that need to apply for change of use planning permission are allowed for a time-limited period of up to 6 months to continue to offer their accommodation as tourist accommodation while their application is being considered. Short-term letting rentals play a significant role in the economic prosperity in many areas across Ireland, and the impact of the introduction of the register on the short-term letting sector has been considered, and Government will work to ensure an appropriate balance of long-term private rental and short-term letting accommodation. There will be benefits for tourism too. These will include helping to address the staffing challenges facing many tourism businesses, as it will provide housing options to tourism and hospitality workers in these areas. The introduction of the register will also provide a level playing field for all accommodation providers by ensuring transparency and visibility across the sector. Finally, the register will allow Fáilte Ireland, for the first time, to have a full picture of the stock of tourist accommodation across the state, and this will significantly enhance Fáilte Ireland's ability to promote and drive tourism investment. We have examined the international context and conducted significant research in this area, which has illustrated the issues caused by an imbalance in supply. These new regulatory controls will ensure balanced and sustainable tourism development. From an EU perspective, I welcome the recent proposal for a regulation to enhance transparency in the field of short-term accommodation rentals and help public authorities ensure their balanced development as a part of public sustainable tourism sector. The EU Commission has concluded that while short-term accommodation bookings offer benefits for hosts and tourists, they can create concerns for certain local communities struggling, for instance, with a lack of affordable housing. The new rules proposed by the EU will improve the collection and sharing of data from hosts and online platforms. This will in turn inform effective and proportionate local policies to address the challenges and opportunities related to the short-term rental sector. It is encouraging that the EU proposal contains many of the features in the general scheme approved by Government today. I am confident that what we are putting in place here is similar to what the online platforms have already implemented in other European cities. I look forward to working with accommodation providers and the online platforms as we progress the legislation in the coming months. Key elements of the bill include the establishment of the short-term tourist letting register and a provision that any party offering accommodation for periods of up to and including 21 nights will need to be registered with Fáilte Ireland. Furthermore, the bill will place an obligation on those advertising properties for short-term letting, mainly online platforms, to ensure that the properties have a valid registration number as provided by Fáilte Ireland. The bill also provides for penalties in the event of non-compliance. Fáilte Ireland may levy a €300 fixed payment notice on property owners who advertise their property without a valid Fáilte Ireland registration number, and also have the option to bring the case to district court, where the maximum fine is up to €5,000. For platforms, Fáilte Ireland can levy fines of up to €5,000 per invalid listing for advertising properties without valid Fáilte Ireland numbers. I am grateful to Minister O'Brien for the positive working relationship between our respective departments, and following today's government decision, I will seek to progress this draft legislation through the Houses of the Oireachtas as quickly as possible, with a view to having the register in place by the end of March 2023. I'm also grateful to Fáilte Ireland CEO Paul Kelly, who will speak more about the technical detail on this shortly, and to his team for their work on this. Our treasured tourism sector cannot exist in a vacuum without our thriving cities and towns, which house those very people who are the ones who attract visitors to these shores in the first place. I believe these new measures will still allow local tourism to grow and develop in a sustainable way, but also help address the crucial needs of communities for long-term housing. Brahan ar narnol luach for tuairtear ar a gathracha agus ar malcha rathúla ina bhfuil a gcónaí ar na daoine sin a bhealinn cuairteoirí go héireann. Credim go gajoí na barta shot don tuairsort áitiúil fós agus ferbert ar bhealach inmhonatha agus codói siad freisin I dulín lech le riachnas rítáhachta na pobl maidir le tuíocht ad thermach. Gur mágah, and I will now hand over to Minister O'Brien.
Gur Margaret Catherine and Dave Galera Wajan. I very much welcome the memorandum brought by Minister Martin to Cabinet, and that we got Cabinet approval for today. It's a very important piece of legislation. If I could say as well, I'd particularly like to thank our colleagues and Paul and the team from Fáilte Ireland for the work that they've done in conjunction with my own department and Catherine's department. As Minister Martin has mentioned, the Programme for Government and Housing for All has committed us to taking action in this area, and specifically to develop new regulatory controls requiring short-term and holiday lets to register with Fáilte Ireland, with the view to ensuring that houses are used to the best effect in the areas of need. As I mentioned, my own department have been working very closely with Minister Martins to fulfil this commitment given by this action. There's no question that a significant number of properties over the last number of years have withdrawn from the long-term rental market and diverted the use to short-term lettings, which has in some areas negatively impacted on supply and availability in the private residential rental accommodation, and the associated knock-on impacts that will have on rental prices and rents being sought in given areas. This trend has continued, and I see the measures that we've agreed today and the draft legislation which will be published later on this afternoon as actually bringing more transparency to this, but also putting the onus on the platforms too, that I know Fáilte Ireland and ourselves have engaged with as well, and provides a register that's similar to registers that's being used in other European jurisdictions. That transparency will be important. This legislation will complement existing planning legislation that's been brought in since 2019 that requires particularly the use of second properties in rent pressure zones, that they would have planning permission to carry out, short-term or tourist rentals. This specific register will deal with rentals up to 21 days, and it will certainly complement what we're actually doing. One of the areas that has been deficient up to now is actually having sight of the properties right across the 31 local authority areas. This register will now provide that. So what we're looking forward to doing is to getting this legislation into the Dáil and Shannon early in Q1. I'll certainly be seeking the cooperation of all opposition parties and opposition members to enable us to pass this legislation as efficiently and as expeditiously as possible, because it will be an important tool that we will use that will complement other work that we've done, particularly in the area of rental, to make sure the property is used appropriately while fully respecting and acknowledging the need that we have good properties available as well on a short-term letting basis in the right area for our tourist offering in this country. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Fáilte Ireland very much welcomes today's Cabinet approval of this important legislation which will underpin Fáilte Ireland's short-term tourism letting registration system. The tourism sector cannot and does not exist in isolation of local communities, and Fáilte Ireland works to develop tourism in a way that is consistent with and complementary with the needs of these host communities, both economically and socially. This requires the appropriate balance be achieved between accommodation that should be used for long-term housing needs and accommodation that is more appropriate for short-term tourism lettings, which of course provides important employment, economic and social benefits to local communities. In line with wider community needs for more housing, the tourism industry itself has highlighted the need for more residential housing for employees, and this is critical to the development of the sector. So both in the context of the long-term sustainable development of tourism and short-term staff accommodation challenges, we believe this initiative is not just good news for housing, but is also good news for tourism. And therefore we have been very pleased to work closely with the officials in the Department of Tourism and Housing and with Ministers Martin and O'Brien on the development of this system under Housing for All. As part of our work, we conducted detailed research into the experience of cities and countries across the world. And based on this international best practice, we have designed an online registration system which will allow property owners to quickly and easily register for short-term letting of properties. We want to make it as easy as possible for property owners to stay in the tourism industry where appropriate. So we have worked hard to make this registration system simple and user-friendly. There must be a balanced mix of long-term private rental and short-term letting accommodation for tourists, and I'm confident that we've found this balance in this legislation. To minimise the disruption to the tourism industry, there will be a clarification period, as Minister Martin refers to, of up to 6 months. This will allow property owners operating in the sector who need to apply for change of use of planning permission to continue to offer their accommodation as tourism accommodation while their application is being considered and processed. Fáilte Ireland will also continue to work with local authorities across the country to ensure the housing stock that is not suitable for private housing may be continued to use for tourism purposes. In conclusion, I'd just like to acknowledge the team in Fáilte Ireland led by our Director of Sector Development Jenny DeSaules and Head of Registration and Grading Fergal O'Leary. This new division has worked tirelessly over the last 12 months on the development of this registrar and to ensure that all registration and process and procedures are in place in advance of the legislation being enacted. We expect to launch the Fáilte Ireland short-term tourism letting system based on successful conclusion of the legislative process in March of next year. Gurmagut.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you, Ministers. We have time for some questions now. To let you know, the press release is up online. The bill will be, the schedule of the bill will be publication shortly as well. Louise, you wanted to ask a question there. Do you want to go first?
Yeah. Hi, Louise Burke, the Art Director. Mr. Martin, at a time when all our hotels are being used by Ukrainian refugees and there's that kind of pressure on the tourism system, are you not concerned now that it's kind of at a really bad time where perhaps there's going to be accommodation taken out of the tourism sector that they could really do it? And then Minister O'Brien, just on the houses that may come back into the market for long-term use, are they not going to be in more remote places, more touristy places that people don't necessarily want to live in year-round? Is that not a concern? And then I suppose as well, if you're asking people to rent out their homes rather than use them as holiday homes, will they not just go, well, I'm not going to get as much money in rent as I would have on Airbnb or whatever, so I can't be bothered, I'm just going to sell up anyway?
In relation to tourism, I suppose I outlined in when I spoke earlier, there's the lack of appropriate housing for tourism staff is an issue through research. This may help with that. I think it's important from transparency and visibility as well that there is a level playing field for all accommodation providers, and also Fáilte Ireland say that if for the first time that have real full picture of the stock of accommodation available, so that helps them inform their investment into those regions, but also that 6 month, that up to 6 month clarification, because we do have to be mindful of the fact that some accommodation providers will already have businesses on the books for 2023, so that gives some leeway there for the peak summer period.
What are you going to do when all the hotels are being used up by Ukrainian refugees? Or is that 6 months part of that in hopes that they'll have moved out of the hotels and will cost that per year?
With relation into short-term lets, I'm saying that gives them some leeway there. In relation to the Ukrainians, this is the biggest humanitarian operation ever undertaken, and the tourism sector has really stepped up. I know there are significant concerns there, and that has been conveyed to the Department of Children Equality and Disability Integration and Youth, and they are working urgently across government with agencies, with NGOs, with local authorities. You can see the alternative modular housing that's going to come on stream in January, the recognition payment of up to €800 on board, and that is front and centre, because we know there's concern there when it comes to the peak tourism period, but that has been conveyed, and I have officials on the senior official group that's dealing with this too.
Yeah, this is about appropriate properties and being used. So it's where properties are within an RPZ and they're second properties already. Going back to the 2019 legislation, properties that are being used for short-term lets as second properties should already have the requisite planning permission. What this is about is providing, that transparency across the board. Of course, making sure that properties where they're appropriate are used for short-term letting. That is an important part of our tourism offering too. But some of the learnings from COVID, if you saw a lot of what were short-term lets coming back into the longer-term market because of the absence of tourism, so it gave us a picture as well to see, properties that are within our towns and cities, within urban areas, within RPZ. So as Catherine and Paul have mentioned as well, we'll have a transition period on this, but it will provide the necessary view right across the 31 local authorities that for someone to advertise and for a platform to advertise, they must have that registration number. So to have that registration number, they must be compliant as well. So it's a further step. This is, a transparency, but also an enforcement measure too. So, we've about 300,000 tenancies in place right now. We understand the pressures, on the rental sector. That's why we're ramping up delivery of cost rental homes. It's why we're ramping up, supply across the board. So this isn't being done in isolation. This is one measure that complements the other actions that are being done in Housing for All.
But are people not going to sell up if they can't get as much in rent, if they can on Airbnb?
Well,
They not just get that up and go, it's not worth my while.
What someone does with their own property, like we respect property rights here too, but I think what this is doing is making sure that there's a regime in place that's in place in other European jurisdictions and indeed across the world that provides ourselves, our local authorities, with a greater picture for what is out there and tries to ensure as best as possible that properties in areas where there are pressures on the rental sector, i.e. the rent pressure zones, are being used appropriately. So if someone seeks the permission to use a second property for a short-term letting property into the future, they can do so. And they can seek that, but it will be up to the local authority to grant that permission. But what this deals with specifically is for lets of under 21 days or 21 days or below. So, we'll work through these measures, but I actually think this will be complementary, such as the measures we've taken on Fair Deal. There was another group of properties that have remained vacant because people are in long-term nursing home accommodation. We've made changes to that to try to incentivise people bringing them back into the sector. So this one measure obviously doesn't sort out the issues within the rental market, but that coupled with increased supply and other policy initiatives we're taking, I do believe will help.
Thanks, Minister. Paul Hosford, followed by Cormac McQueen.
Minister Martin, you said that this initiative could return about 12,000 back to the 12,000 homes back to both the rental and sales market. That could drastically bring down rental prices, could affect affordability. The government's been in place for 2.5 years. What took so long to get this in place? And then, Minister O'Brien, the capital underspend in your department, it's December now, it's about €700 million. Generally speaking, there is normally a limit on what you can carry over. Will your department have unspent money that will have to be returned to the Exchequer at the end of this year?
No, we won't. Just maybe to answer that, I've repeatedly said, and this is not just this year, but in successive years, that Q4 there will be very strong delivery. And there'll be very strong expenditure in that space. I've said before as well, we will be, like other departments, maximising our 10% carryover into next year. That has already been allowed for. We've stated that already, but there will be no surrender of capital back. The initiatives, both in building new homes, we will deliver more social homes, new social homes this year than we've done in decades. Affordable homes for the first time in a generation. There were issues certainly in March, April, May with regard to supply chain, with regard to inflation, which government responded to make sure that projects continued. So there will be some overhang into early next year, and I think most people will understand that. That's not just something that's specific to us here in Ireland, but right the way across the developed world. But there'll be no capital surrender this year.
This was about, I suppose, money was allocated in the budget for Fáilte Ireland to do the research on this and get the people in place for when we'd get the bill over the line and through the houses, that they'd be able to be fully operational by hopefully the end of March with that register. So we moved as quickly as possible, doing the relevant consultation and looking at the international standards too. I don't know if Paul wants to expand on that.
Yeah, no, I mean, you know, in terms of, I said, kind of the original money was made available in the budget the year before last, which enabled us to put the team in place, start building the system, so that we would be ready to go and do all of the necessary international research, etc. So I suppose it is important that this is done right. And is done in a way that has a lasting positive effect. And I say, kind of, we as soon as the legislation is in place, we will be ready to go at the end of Q1 next year.
Are you confident that you guys have the staff to actually monitor this once it goes live?
Yeah, we've been building the team across this year, so we've been putting that team in place, and we will have, yeah, we've been well resourced by the government in order to do that, so we'll have that team in place.
To Minister Martin, you mentioned a number of offences carry fines there related to the register, presumably non-registration. How will those fines apply to both the property owner and to the online platform, and how will it be enforced? Will there be somebody from Fáilte Ireland trawling Airbnb or other websites to find non-registered properties? To Minister O'Brien, as I understand it, as of September 1st, there's an offence for people, for platforms to advertise properties that don't have the proper planning permission. You know, how has that been enforced? Have there been any cases since that came into force? And for Mr. Kelly, Minister Martin mentioned the international research you did to suggest that it will return properties to the market, to the rental market, maybe 12,000. How does it do that though? Is it just that putting in place these sort of measures creates more hassle for people? How does that work? Yeah,
so the fines are for the individual property owner up to €300, but on a fixed payment notice that can go to 5,000 if brought to district court. For the platforms, it's €5,000 per property, and it'll be the authorised officers that'll be in place with Fáilte Ireland if Paul wants to talk to that. But that's part of what we've been doing in the last year, is having these people in place to check on this.
Yeah, just to build on that, I suppose effectively, you know, providing one of the real challenges that has existed in this space, and it's existed for local authorities to try and enforce it, is that currently there is very difficult to identify individual properties from what's advertised, because quite often you have to go beyond a credit card paywall to see the exact air code and the address of the property. So what this system is going to be a single register where there will be a property registration number tied to an air code of the property. So our compliance officers and enforcement officers will be able to look at what is advertised on the various platforms that advertise these properties, be able to check that registration number, check if that's a valid registration number, and check if that ties to the property. Local authorities now, we will, of course, that list will be publicly available to local authorities. Local authorities will be able to check the air code of every single property that is now advertised. They'll be able to have that air code on a single list, and will be able to see whether that has the appropriate planning permission or not. Now, that's been incredibly difficult for local authorities up until now, because they haven't been able to access those air codes, so they've been trying to hunt down, well, which house exactly is that's been advertised in that, you know, in that general area. So that's the key thing, the tying. Yeah. No, the online ad will have the registration number. It'll have to have the registration number, and it'll have to have that registration number displayed before booking. So before you go beyond the credit card paywall, that registration number will be publicly available. And then our staff will be trawling that and making sure that that is a legitimate registration number for that property. And then our list will tie that registration number to the air code, and that's what will enable local authorities to determine whether the appropriate planning is in place or not.
Kind of follows on from what Cormac just answered your question, from what Paul and Catherine have said. Up to now, the issue has been that visibility. And now the local authorities will have a big role in this too, because the planning legislation is in place actually since 2019. The interim measures that you've referred to from the 1st of September were sending out a clear signal to the platforms that this is happening. In relation to... Well, this is the long-term measure. Like what we wanted to do, and we were very clear in Housing for All, is that we would have a register that is, is updated, is accessible, that gives a basis for anyone actually to see properties that are available. But really importantly, on the enforcement side of things, that our local authorities working with Fáilte Ireland will be able to flag properties. And if someone doesn't have the required permission, well then they will advise Fáilte Ireland, and that property will be taken down from the register. So this is the, this is the longer term register that will be in place with us for years to come.
Can you be fined for not being registered and not having the proper?
Yeah, well, under the existing legislation, going back to the previous government, actually 2019, particularly for a second property, you're letting it over 90 days, it requires to have that planning permission. The issue has been enforcement heretofore and visibility of that, and this will help in that regard.
Sorry, just how it returns properties to the rental market. So in terms of how that will return, I mean, for example, the experience in Amsterdam was that they had about 19,000 properties, and when they introduced this register, that dropped to about 4,500 properties on short-term letting. Now, those numbers need to be taken in context because that also happened across COVID when a number of properties were coming out of the market anyway, and those numbers are beginning to go back up. So we don't think we'll have that scale of a drop in Ireland. So why it effectively does it is because it is that the visibility of the property, if it has appropriate planning permission or not, is the thing that will pull those properties out of the rental market. So, a lot of those properties, a lot of them are out in kind of rural areas that are appropriate for, that are in holiday type destinations by beaches and other things. So they are appropriate for tourism accommodation, but there's a lot of them that are in town centres and in city centres that were actually designed and built to be long-term residential properties that have now flipped into this space. So it is those kind of properties where the local authority will say they don't have the appropriate planning permission to be let out as short-term tourism, and that's what will take them out of the system.
Thanks, Paul. Sorry, I'm conscious of a few people to get through. Gavin from Virgin News.
Thanks very much. Just a follow-up actually on what Cormac was just asking to Minister O'Brien. He mentioned that the legislation that was passed before the summer recess, which was intended to clamp down on the advertisement of short-term lettings. It seems that you signed regulations in October which effectively nullified that, apparently on the premise of there being an issue with some European directive.
Yeah.
Can you just flesh that out and explain what's different? And also, can we just get you to comment separately on Threshold issuing their annual report this morning? They say that over half of the nearly 20,000 households that approached them for help last year were deemed to be at risk of entering homelessness. What does that say about the government's performance today?
Yeah, just with regard to Threshold, I work with John Mark and the team on a weekly basis. Actually, Threshold sit on our National Homeless Action Committee and play a really important role. Actually, government information in relation to tenancy rights and advocacy for tenants. We support the Threshold campaigns. Actually, financially, they're a really important part of what we've done. And the launch of their annual report today actually shows how important that work is in the preventions that they have been able to help people preventing from going into homelessness. Now, look, we're all aware of the challenge that's there, particularly in the area of homelessness, and the big priority, the main priority for us is to see the numbers in homelessness reducing, but also preventing further people from going into homelessness. And Threshold play a really important role in that, but fundamentally within all of it, it is about supply. It is about increasing the number of properties available, new properties built. We are going to exceed our Housing for All target this year of 24,600 new properties, and we'll exceed that quite substantially. We have a good pipeline into next year. Not that next year will not be without its challenges, of course it will. We live in a high-cost environment, a high funding cost environment, and inflation obviously has had an impact. But government measures that we brought forward around activation, land activation, writing down of local authority debt, to enable the development of land that has been sitting there for 10, 15 years, and particularly focusing on the modern methods of construction to ramp up through modular and off-site construction the delivery of more social and affordable homes. So, Threshold in their annual report today have shown the really important work that they do, that's supported directly by me and by my own department. In relation to the regulations that you referred to, Gavin, there was a notification issue with regard to the European Commission, and they were re-notified in that regard, and that is being done right now.
Just sorry, a few people to get through this as a schedule for the ministers in terms of events after this. Gabby, followed by Craig, followed by Adam, followed by Sarah.
Mr. Martin, just obviously the biggest issue I suppose with this is that councils have not been able to clamp down on short-term lets properly. there seems to be kind of now an additional step added on to Fáilte Ireland are going to have a role. Like, how much staff have Fáilte Ireland hired, and are you going to give extra money to local councils to actually be able to, I suppose, sit down and go through the register? Like, how does that work link up, and does that not make it even more awkward and complicated? There are obviously some of the platforms are Airbnb and Booking.com, but also people do advertise their properties on social media sites, for example. Are you going to find those also? And also, just on that research, is Fáilte Ireland going to publish the research, the international research that you did?
Thank you, Gavin.
Yeah, so there's money in place from 2022 to 2024 in relation to resource in Fáilte Ireland, and after that we would see the fee that has to be paid every year. It'll be self-financing, but there, I think there's over 5 million there that has been allocated to Fáilte Ireland, and as I said, they have their authorised officers and are absolutely confident that they will be able to resource it properly. In relation to local authorities, that's separate. See, this is a registration, the regulator, whereas the local authorities, the full planning aspect lies with local authorities and with Minister O'Brien. But where it helps is that the local authorities will now be able to, it's visible in real time, so it'll assist them in following up on the planning areas.
And just,
Have a role in actually keeping track of what's on the register, isn't that right?
oh yeah, just maybe to answer on the resourcing on the local authority side, like we've approved 300 new posts in social housing alone across local authorities, another 69 posts in affordable housing. So the housing teams are well resourced as well within our enforcement sections in the local authorities.
And just if you don't mind, on how much extra staff you have hired?
12, is it, Fergal? 10. 10, yeah. 10 dedicated staff. But really important to this is that this is needs to be a highly automated system, and it is, you know, in terms of this is about online registration, and this is about connecting in using technology into the various online platforms. You know, there's no doubt that no system will be 100%. You know, so if somebody advertises their property, you know, by sticking a sign up on a lamppost, that's going to be a lot harder to find than if they go on one of the large advertising platforms. But you know, in terms of you know, we will deal with the vast majority of, we will find and deal with the vast majority of properties that are advertised and ensure that they have the appropriate registration.
Will you publish that research?
In terms of, if there's specific questions, I mean, because it is not a specific study, what we've done is engaged and looked at what has happened across different markets and spoke to different people, etc. So it's not a particular, there's no one magic report, as it were. It's, you know, desk research across a number of things.
To clarify, how is it difficult to keep track of properties that are on Airbnb? If the same advert is there, you're saying that issue is there with the air code. Like, if there's an advertisement of the same house, you scroll through the photographs of the bedrooms are the same. It's been there for months and months and months. How is it difficult to keep track of that? What does the air code have to do with it?
Well, Gabby, I think it's the registration number is crucially important, because you won't be able to advertise it without a registration number. That's been what's lacking now. Whereas at the moment, I could take your point, you know, anyone can go into Booking.com, Airbnb, do that. Now it brings the platforms in and the onus on them in a real way through the registers that you're not actually going to be able to advertise that property without the registration number.
But you're saying that you couldn't clamp down beforehand because you couldn't access the
It was just no, not the air code. It was like basically it was actually about having visibility about what's out there. Now you've got one central place, as opposed to having, let's say, an individual in enforcement going through Booking.com, going through Airbnb, going through all the different ones. It brings it into one central point, and that's the important thing that'll make it more efficient to deal with.
Folks, we can
And
follow up
sorry,
some stuff.
are you going to find social media sites if people advertise on, let's say, Facebook?
Well, as Paul said, it's going to be hard to capture everyone. It's looking at the platforms, it's looking what's advertised in papers as well. But I suppose if it comes to people's attention on those, then if an individual is advertising and they don't have a registration number, then they will be fined.
Okay, thanks very much. Craig, Adam, and then Sarah. I'm conscious of just trying to get everybody a question at least, but we're really under pressure now. Craig, just behind the row. Sorry. Thank you.
Minister O'Brien, did you get cabinet approval today to table the amendment in the Shannon in relation on the planning and forestry bill? And can you just explain what that'll do?
I did.
And how many units are you expecting to be commenced as a result of that next year, because I believe that's a requirement. Isn't it?
Yeah, I did get approval this morning at Cabinet to bring forward a time-bound amendment which would be about exempting social and affordable housing permissions under a new section in the Planning Act. I'll bring that amendment actually into the Dáil next week and then bring it back into the Shannon. That's the plan with it. It's time-bound and it'll be very much focused on land that's already identified by local authorities, either owned by local authorities or owned by a state agency, and that's zoned for housing already. It's a measure to expedite further additional delivery of social and affordable homes that we'll use through off-site construction and modular. We've already done quite a detailed assessment of the sites, and one thing we're focusing on is the encumbered sites. So these were pieces of land that were debt laden, that local authorities would have bought maybe 20 years or so ago. And what we brought forward is the Land Activation Fund of 100 million that will write down that debt on the basis that the local authorities move forward with the development of these sites next year or at the very latest in 2024. So that measure will go to the Dáil and Shannon, and I'll be looking for the cooperation from all parties within the Dáil, government and opposition. Government have approved it, but opposition, to bring forward this measure that's very much going to help to expedite the delivery of additional social and affordable homes on local authority and state-owned land.
But do you have any estimate in terms of how many units could be?
Yeah, what we're doing, Craig, is we're assessing the land that's there and obviously looking at the capacity of each of those land holdings as to what we can deliver. But it would be upwards of over 1,000 initially next year. But we've got to complete the full assessment, so there's a health warning with that. But what we'll also do is look at centrally managing those additional sites, managing the procurement of the off-site construction. We need to ramp that up, and there is good capacity in Ireland. There are really good producers in Ireland and indeed in Europe of good modular off-site construction, and I want to see that done. And this is a measure that needs to be in before Christmas and will be. I intend to move the amendment into the Dáil next week and bring it back into the Shannon then.
So is it €100 million fund for 1,000 homes?
Well, these are sites that have been bought by local authorities, some of them 20 years ago, that they haven't been able to develop because there's debt on those lands. So what we have done, and this was 2 weeks ago, a Cabinet got approval to bring forward an initial fund of 100 million that would write down local authority debt to enable those sites to be developed. And this will be tied very much to this activation measure under expedited planning.
Thanks very much, Minister and Craig. Adam, followed by Sarah, and then we're going to have to wrap up with breaks.
Minister Martin, how much do you engage with the online platforms for this register? And if we publicly make that register available, does that not create security concerns for the households that register? Because from what I understand, people on Airbnb, it doesn't give you the exact address so that people don't know that house will be empty this weekend or that week. And then separately, Paul, can I ask you, between this removing up to 12,000 homes from the short-term lettings, the Ukraine humanitarian crisis taking a lot of hotel rooms out of the system, how concerned are you about Ireland's tourism sector next year?
Okay, just I suppose, just to clarify, I may have misspoke earlier in terms of the availability of tying the property registration number to the air code will be available for local authorities to look at. It won't be published publicly, but it will be available for the appropriate authorities to look at from a planning point of view. So in terms of that's how that bit will work. With regards to, look, there is no doubt that the availability of accommodation from a tourism point of view is a major concern for everyone involved in tourism, in terms of the humanitarian response of the government has taken a very significant proportion of the accommodation stock out of the tourism sector. We have seen a drop in this non-registered stock across COVID. Obviously we're looking at more of this stock coming out of the system. That is the right thing to do because we are facing a housing crisis obviously as a country, and it's the right thing to do from a long-term tourism development point of view. But it is, the availability of accommodation stock is probably the biggest challenge to the tourism sector next year. We are very concerned about it, and we're going to be trying to work through it, and we know the government are working to try and find as Minister said, as many alternative places for accommodation for humanitarian needs as possible, and that is really important work, and we do want to see as much of the tourism accommodation come back into tourism as quickly as it can.
Just to confirm, there has been engagement up to today and including this morning. The online platforms were briefed by my officials.
Thanks, Ministers. Sarah, just lastly.
Hi, Sarah McGuinness from the Journal. So just really, when will that fleet of 12,000 properties be delivered? Quarter one has been mentioned, March 23 has been mentioned, but as we've seen from BPFI report yesterday, the market is being strangled by demand outstripping supply. So when can people expect to see those exactly? And then secondly, there was a Eurus Ireland event in Madrid last month, which Volta Ireland attended, and 15,000 people tuned into that, and they were encouraged to come to Ireland, where employment awaits them. Little did they know, no accommodation awaits them. So why are we still encouraging people to come here? And really, when will the housing crisis and the precedence of that when will that take precedence over creating jobs and expanding the workforce?
Maybe if I could just specifically with regard to supply, look, we've had 10, 12 years of significant undersupply on housing, particularly in social and affordable housing. We've had no affordable homes to speak of for the last 10 years. That's changing this year. So we've people in cost rental homes, we've people buying local authority-led affordable homes, and we've things like the First Home Scheme in place. Now this year, just since July, we've had over 700 approvals. But fundamentally, this year we'd set a target of 24,600, and building the capacity up within the construction sector, that's both public and private. We're going to exceed that this year. No, I understand, and I'm absolutely acutely aware of the challenges that we face and the crisis that we're in. The only way to address that permanently is to actually to ramp the supply up that meets that demand, both in public and private. And this year we're going to deliver more social homes than we've done in decades, and we'll do that again next year. And it's about catching up, frankly, and I fully get the point that you're making. But, you know, housing across all tenures is the priority for government. That's why we have a Housing for All plan that next year will be €4.5 billion in capital that's fully funded. And you see measures here today that all feed in. It's a cross-government approach towards tackling housing. Plan is taking hold this year. Lots of people don't feel that. I get that completely. And it will take time to change it. The plan's only over a year old. We're never going to change that in a year. But the outlook is positive. The performance this year has been decent. And we need to ramp that up further. That's why some of the measures that were asked about earlier on by Craig in relation to expediting planning. And I would hope that parties who've called for, measures in this area actually now support the measures that I'm bringing forward.
Yeah, I suppose in terms of with regards to the Eurus thing, I mean, obviously we're all familiar with the significant staffing challenges that the tourism sector and they've been looking to a whole range of initiatives, and recruiting people from overseas has been one of the initiatives that we've supported. But the tourism sector are taking action themselves. So we are seeing hotels where they're allocating a certain number of their bedrooms for staff accommodation. We're seeing some hotels that are building dedicated staff accommodation blocks, and it is certainly one of the biggest challenge in bringing overseas workers to work in Ireland to address those staffing challenges is providing them with accommodation. And that is something that obviously when people are going out to recruit in overseas markets, they're conscious of bringing a solution with them in terms of things like, as I say, taking some of their bedrooms out to accommodate staff.
To them, a colleague in the Journal wrote an article on that, and it seemed very little people were aware of how dire the situation truly was. We've spoken a lot about transparency today. Do we not owe them that transparency as well?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any lack of transparency. I think anyone coming to Ireland knows the challenges in finding accommodation, in terms of it, I don't think there's any major lack of transparency there.
And as Paul said, the industry themselves are doing things like building blocks or providing hotel rooms. And as I said earlier, this very initiative could help as well, because it's in the areas, the tourism hotspots, that you will now have longer term rentals available for the actual staff. So it will help them as well.
Thanks.
Everybody, just let you know if you need any more information.